Thank you, and I thank all the panelists, particularly my good friend and former colleague, Brad Miller. Very good to see you again. So I'd like to ask Congressman Miller about the NCUA Budget Transparency Act, which would require the NCUA to publish its draft budget in the Federal Register and hold a public hearing on its budget. And it's my understanding that no other banking regulator is required to hold these hearings. So it's a little unclear to me why NCUA should be singled out for this particular requirement. I also understand that NCUA voluntarily held hearings on its budget prior to the financial crisis, and that the industry stakeholders consistently lobbied them during these hearings to cut their budget. And as a result of these budget cuts, the NCUA itself admits that it wasn't fully prepared when the crisis hit. So according to a letter from NCUA, these budget cuts meant that it was, quote, insufficiently resourced, end quote, to address the financial crisis. I'd like unanimous consent to place this letter into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
So I guess my question is, knowing what we know now, do you think it's wise to make these public hearings on NCUA's budget mandatory?
Ms. Maloney, I hate to say this, but of the 12 bills, that is not one to which I've given a great deal of attention. I do know that, as you said, the other financial regulators, for the most part, certainly the safety and soundness regulators, have an independent funding source that comes from the regulated. And they have all provided justifications that are, fairly vague, given how much money is involved to Congress as part of their statute, but they have not had hearings, and there has been some limit to the extent to which Congress can intrude, which has made those industries, for the most part, stronger, because those regulatory agencies that depend upon annual appropriations like SEC, like CFTC, like the old OFAO, which preceded the FHFA, that needed annual appropriations, those regulated by that agency could come in and lobby Congress to cut back on their ability to investigate conduct in the industry. That was particularly true of OFAO. OFAO was probably the most captured regulatory agencies in all of U.S. history. They were supposed to regulate Fannie and Freddie, and Fannie and Freddie were both very powerful. Were both very powerful in Washington, and were able to keep OFAO about as captured as an agency could possibly be. So I'm inclined to agree with you. But I have to admit this is not something to which I've given a great deal of thought.
Well, what about the requirement that they are the only banking regulator that's required to hold these hearings? Why should they be singled out?
And like I said, I'm inclined to agree with you. And since OCC does not, since FDIC does not, since I hate to say CFPB in this room. But since OCC does not, I'm inclined to think NCUA should not either.
Well, then I'd also like to ask you about H.R. 2213, which would create a statutory safe harbor from the enforcement of CFPB's new integrated disclosure form through the end of 2015. And I led a bipartisan letter with Mr. Barr from Kentucky. I don't think he's here right now. I don't see him. Asking for a grace period on the integrated disclosure requirement through the end of the year for lenders who make good faith efforts to comply. And this is what the CFPB did for the QM rule as well. And 254 members, many members on this committee, signed on to our letter. And last week the CFPB responded to our letter and did promise to observe the same kind of grace period that they did for the QM rule. And I'd like unanimous consent to place in the record the response to Andy Barr and myself from CFPB.
Without objection, so ordered.
Now the CFPB's letter was a little unclear on how long this grace period would last, and I hope that they'll offer some further clarity. But given that the CFPB has already indicated a willingness to offer the industry some sort of grace period, when the new integrated disclosure forms take effect on August 1st, do you think it is necessary to pass legislation codifying a safe harbor? Uh-oh, my time is up.
I'm sorry, the gentleman